Australia access to additional skills and a diversity of lived experience. International students consistently study in fields with entrenched workforce shortages, such as engineering, health, IT, food and hospitality, and management and commerce. This workforce is critical to the growth aspirations of South Australia as a complement to the local workforce. It is projected that over the next 5 years, more than 90% of new jobs will require post-school qualifications, with over 50% requiring a bachelor degree or higher. International students are a really important part of the way that South Australia and Australia can address these skills needs. Our data shows that 68% of international students aim to remain in South Australia after graduating. For the 32% that wish to return home or go to a third country, their connection to and understanding of Adelaide because of their time living in our city creates global advocates. The people-to-people connections created through international education provides an advantage to South Australia as these graduates move through their career or start their own companies, providing a shared experience or perspective from conversations to then start from. And even while students are studying here, they are ambassadors to Adelaide, attracting their family and friends to prioritise Adelaide over other holiday destinations to come and visit them. Because ultimately these students have chosen Adelaide as their study destination out of a literal world of options. The establishment of Adelaide University will only strengthen the consideration of Adelaide as a study destination. I remain excited by the transformation the establishment of Adelaide University represents, and StudyAdelaide looks forward to working with the university, as well as all of our members, to promote Adelaide, to attract and retain high-quality international students for the benefit of South Australia and the students. Thank you.
Questions from members?
Sure, I'll jump in.
Oh, Reggie.
So, with the proposed new university, do you see this as a good opportunity for bringing more students, or do you think it won't have much impact on the number of people coming to South Australia?
I think it will have an impact on the number of international students that choose South Australia. What particularly excites me about the vision of the university is around the curriculum and the way it's being talked about, transforming the curriculum and what will be taught and the linkages that will be established between both the university programs but also with industry. Because we know from a number of different surveys that international students are really motivated by the opportunity to get both the actual academic qualification but also some real world linkages and the opportunity to be exposed to industry. So I think that will be really well received overseas.
Do you think there are any risks, anything that might happen that could make it drop off the number of international students?
I think a risk with something of this scale is potentially in the execution. However, I really feel that there will be strong governance around this process, and that would be with the university to be managed.
Great, thank you.
Further questions? Member for Morehouse.
Sure, I've got just a couple. Hi. One of the things, Jane, you said was in relation to international students tend to study courses where there is a significant skills need in our workforce, and that I suppose presupposes migration status as well. I'm really interested. It's not directly to the specific proposal, but it's attached. It's something that perhaps the committee could consider suggesting to government as an addition to the proposal. What road bumps or blockages are there that, in your experience, make it harder for us to get international students onto that migration pathway, or indeed for us to attract international students to Australia to study courses where we know we'll need those skills later?
In terms of the barriers, I think one of the things for South Australia is actually just awareness on a global stage. So these students are considering different countries, then different cities. So there's an awareness piece there. In terms of your question around the migration and predisposing that, there's actually, for an international student who studies at a bachelor degree or above, there is a visa that they can move on to that allows them to have the same ability to work as a local student upon graduation, called the 485 visa. And I think one of the biggest barriers is actually a lack of understanding within employers about that visa category and the opportunity that it represents for businesses to be able to employ an international student like a local student. And I think that that would be something where raising awareness of that, which is something Study Adelaide looks to do, to make sure that international students can have that lived experience of actually working in South Australia and contributing to our workforce in these areas of workforce need, would be really powerful. We do a lot of work to make sure that international students are also taken not only into metropolitan businesses, but we also work to get international students out to our regions where there's really specific and acute workforce needs. And in those areas, we also look to make sure that the international students and the businesses have a real understanding of the opportunities that they can have throughout South Australia.
And how much of your remit extends to non-degree qualifications and other international education institutions, particularly in the technical and skills area?
So our remit is for across the entire international education sector. So it ranges from high schools and vocational education providers. So we have members who are both public, so TAFE SA, but as well as private vocational education providers. So we also promote them, and we make sure that the vocational sector is included in terms of how we represent the entire international education sector here in South Australia.
And presumably the marketing you do is bespoke to sector and market?
It is, because the decision-making drivers for different sectors changes, both in terms of which market we're talking in and what the decision-making drivers are for the market, as well as the qualification they're looking for. So for something like vocational education, we might be talking through the industry applied learning that they naturally get, which is a core element of vocational education.
So in addition to the work Study Adelaide does, obviously the three universities as they are at the moment have their own fairly substantial budgets for marketing internationally, and as I understand it, you endeavour to work complementarily with them. I understand the $30 million as part of the package that we're looking at is intended, I think, to go to the university rather than to Study Adelaide specifically, to build the awareness of their particular brand. I guess what I'm wondering is if the focus that you've described, which I think we all agree is important, more funding to Study Adelaide would, I presume, be welcome in the context of a merger going ahead or not. More funding to pursue those goals is a good thing as a general rule.
Absolutely. We are always looking to how we can make sure that we're putting out a strong presence on the global stage. Study Adelaide recently received additional funding in the 23-24 state government budget. We saw an uplift there. So that is going to definitely assist in how we can put the compelling case forward about why an international student choose Adelaide as their study destination.
And the proportion of your work that goes towards the university sector compared to the effort that the universities themselves put in, do you have any insight into that, or do they keep that pretty secret?
I don't have insight into that specifically. We work in close alignment with the universities, though, to make sure that when we're in market, we're consistently building on each other's narratives and making sure that collectively, as a state, we are putting forward a really compelling argument around why you would choose South Australia. Then each of the universities uses the destination marketing advantage that we have provided to then talk about the unique elements of their own institution.
Honourable Sarah Game.
Thank you. I'm just wondering how much does Study Adelaide expect the number of international students to increase by, and whether you expect that increase to be sustainable as other countries continue to develop their capacity to educate their own students, and whether you've got any concerns about our ability to accommodate the increased numbers of international students.
So Study Adelaide hasn't done any formal forecasting in terms of the number of students that we expect. Are you talking, sorry, about the merger?
Yes.
Yes, so what I've seen made publicly available is that they're looking to increase the number of international students by, I believe, 6,000 by 2034, which we think is achievable given the compelling nature of what they're putting forward as the offering in international markets. In terms of the accommodation question, while accommodation remains tight across Australia, Adelaide's actually in a better position than some of the other states and territories, partly because of the increased investment in purpose-built student accommodation that occurred during the pandemic, which meant that we came out of the pandemic with a larger amount of purpose-built student accommodation supplied than we had going into it. We've also recently done a survey of students who are arriving for second semester and found that 68% of those students had secured accommodation before arriving in South Australia. And we feel that when we've surveyed those students about their expectation around price for that accommodation, it was generally within the expectations of what they expected. With student accommodation as well, we feel that with the investment that's going to be going into this university and with the compelling proposition about what it offers, that may also attract investment in international student accommodation to come into the city, providing further supply.
Thank you.
Member for Adelaide.
Thank you. My question is around the challenge of, the competitive market when it comes to international students, and how the establishment of Adelaide University will really create a spotlight on South Australia, and how important that is, if you can comment on how important that buzz and excitement around the establishment of a new university, but also how it actually would benefit all our educational institutions here in the case of, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah, the new university does create the opportunity to shine a spotlight on Adelaide. International education is incredibly competitive, and international students are considering not only institutions within a state or within a country, but between countries as well. And so as many countries look to recover the international student numbers that they enjoyed pre-COVID, there is an increasing competitive activity. The establishment of this university with the vision that is being put forward would offer a really compelling opportunity for Adelaide to be spotlit in terms of what it is representing, both in terms of rankings, but also in terms of, as I spoke to earlier, the actual makeup of the degrees and the focus on things like entrepreneurship, which we know is a driver for some international students, but also things such as the linkage through to industry, which we know again is a driver for international student choice. So something like the establishment of this university certainly will provide a greater spotlight on the destination, and that therefore does bring more opportunities for all the education providers within South Australia, noting that some students might start with an English language course at an ELICOS provider, for example, or start with vocational education at one of our trainers and then move through to the University of Adelaide.
Member for Florey.
Johnston, I just want to get you to clarify something you said about exposure, in particular when it comes to rankings.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard from others that international students in particular will pick the highest ranked university that they can afford to go to. Just wondering if you would comment on that and how important you feel that world rankings will be to attracting overseas students.
World rankings, university rankings, are important as a decision-making driver for international students, but the importance does vary between countries. So in South Australia, we have international students from over 130 nationalities here in our city. Each of those students would have a different level of decision-making driver about where they're going to invest and live and study and can potentially work. But the rankings do provide one proxy indicator for quality of education institution. It is only one, and it may not be what each student actually prioritises first and foremost, but certainly for some markets is an important indicator. So when international students are considering destinations, especially for a destination like South Australia, which may not have the global recognition of a New York or a Tokyo, seeing it the institution and the ranking higher up the list will give a boost in terms of the recognition of that institution on the global stage.
Lieutenant Franks.
Thank you. As a supplementary on that, the evidence that we heard yesterday was that in markets such as China, that the prestige is what is more important because the finances aren't necessarily as pressing, but where different countries are sending family members who might not have that access to wealth, then it is more about the experience or more about the price point being lower. In terms of the countries that are currently attracted to sending students, particularly to UniSA. What do we know about that demographic and that marketing, and how will that change with this merger?
I can speak to what countries are attracted to South Australia, but I don't actually have the insight into what market makeup is actually specifically for the University of South Australia. So that would have to be a question for the University of South Australia. But
Does that mean that each institution only knows their own data? Is there no overarching?
I would expect each
piece of work?
institution. Yeah, I would expect each institution knows their own data, and that there isn't a combined set of data.
Okay.
What I have is obviously the entire state's data, but not at an institution level.
Okay. So which countries do we know from the data that you do have access to, more at that experience, safety, familiarity, etc.? Because I do know that students come and have the good experience, take it back to their particular communities, families, towns, etc., and that word of mouth is really important. So what are our primary countries that we're talking about here outside of China?
So in terms of countries outside of China, the next top countries for higher education specifically are India, Nepal, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Singapore, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Philippines and Colombia as the top.
And of those, which countries are typically motivated by that prestige research metric?
I think there's cohorts within each of those countries. I struggle to generalise an entire nationality to what drives them, because within each country there will be drivers of difference within them. However, I would say in terms of which ones are definitely driven by prestige, as we've mentioned China, I would say actually, I wouldn't want to be drawn on which ones actually look to prestige more than look to student experience, because sometimes there might be depending on what that student's studying, there might be an importance. So if a student's a researcher, for example, there might be a drive around the research excellence in one field, and therefore rankings in that particular field might be a really big driver of decision making.
Yes. And with the accommodation, so you're saying that at the moment we came out of the pandemic with increased international student accommodation. Is that the case? What are the numbers we're talking about there?
Increased purpose-built student accommodation, because there's a lot of different categories that would make up how a student might be accommodated. So homestay is one, residential colleges is another, but for the purpose-built student accommodation, yes, we came out with more capacity out of the pandemic than what we had going into the pandemic. In terms of the exact breakdown of numbers, I'll have to take that on notice.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a rough ball figure?
Not one I'd want to put out without checking.
Can you identify which buildings then we're talking about?
So Yugo, which is on North Terrace and Frome Road. Then there's also the Switch, which is further down North Terrace and opposite the museum. We've also got Y Suites, which is in Weymouth Street, which has been built. So those three alone is all new capacity that came through during the pandemic.
Right. Were any of them down south at all in terms of Flinders, or?
Not to my knowledge, no.
So very, very CBD centric. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Honourable Jingley.
Thank you, Chair. As an extended sort of like marketing arms of all the university's education institutions, as an important stakeholder to this, I just need a timeline, when were you invited to be part of this merger discussion? Were you formally invited as part of the merger discussion with the two universities, at which point? And also, subsequent to that, did you have any consultations with your other stakeholders and members of StudyAdelaide to shape the discussion and formulate some sort of agreement? Was any of those taken place?
So StudyAdelaide wasn't formally invited to be part of the consultation around the merger. That was a decision for the two universities to make, and the governance of those two universities. In terms of your question around what has been the process with our members, given that it is still under consideration, it's not something that we have discussed with our members.
Then I turn my question to your international agents that's promoting Adelaide or South Australia as an educational destination at the moment, I'm sure they would have, through the news, found out about the potential or the proposal for a merger. What feedback have you received so far? Pro or not, or otherwise? Have you been collecting those data or feedback?
We haven't been collecting that data through a formal process. However, we've had international education agents who have reached out and wanted to understand from our perspective more about the merger, and in each of those cases we've actually directed them on to the university for them to be able to liaise directly with either UniSA or Adelaide University or both.
Further questions?
So just quickly on that, so what you're saying, I think, is that there's been a fair degree of interest already from international education agents in the potential merger. Is that right?
There has been interest, yes, absolutely. It's education agents make up 75% of all international education enrolments into this state, so they're a critical part of the ecosystem of international education. So they are a group who are naturally very interested in what will be happening through the Adelaide University establishment.
Can I just clarify, when you're talking interest, they're calling to express their support, or they're interested to know more about it?
Interested in an update.
Yeah, thanks. I have one other question following on from the Honourable Tammy Franks's earlier question. In terms of the different countries of our markets, I recall a few years ago the Chinese international student market went over 40% of our international students, and I think 2018 or 2019 it dropped down a bit as we were diversifying our pool. How much of our international student market currently is from the People's Republic of China? And is that trending up or down at the moment?
So overall, for all sectors, China is our second largest market. India is now our largest international student market.
What about just for higher education?
For higher education,
Sorry, I should have been clearer. Just universities.
Higher education captures both universities but also higher education providers. And China is our largest market for that sector. And in 2022, that was 6,775 students. However, that market has softened over time.
What percentage is that? Or 6,000 and so forth out of how many total?
I'd have to take that on notice. I don't have my percentages here.
Do you have the total number of international students?
Total number across...
In higher education, universities and higher education providers?
Yes, that is 23,152.
Okay, so about 30% or thereabouts. And when you say universities and higher education providers, I assume you're talking about small degree-giving institutions like Tabor or Adelaide Central School of Arts, numbers relatively small, or are there others that I'm
There'd
not
be
thinking of?
Torrens University in that group, as well as institutions like Kaplan Business School, and there might be other providers who do a higher degree qualification, even like International College of Hotel Management, who provide it.
Further questions?
Chair, I only have one question, and it's not directly related to any of the responses you've given. I just want to know if this was a consideration. When we had the August announcements, there were obviously announcements around additional placements, but also courses that would be limited to Australian students only. And I just want to know that in making the assessments that you've made and the discussions or the information you've given us around curriculum, the linkages to booming areas of study based on demand and industries, those limitations for international students don't do anything to change your view on the benefits of this proposal, do they? Or do they?
No, they don't. So while some of those courses and work integrated learning options around AUKUS won't be available for international students, the demand that's going to be driven for people with security clearance to take on those roles means that there will be, I expect, a vacuum of opportunities in other engineering companies, for example, or other parts of the economy where they are going to be looking to supplement the workforce that will then be taken on to deliver in the AUKUS areas.
So that could then have a benefit in terms of those other enrolments that we've talked about, or international placements that we've
Yeah,
talked about.
that's my understanding.
Honourable Tammy Franks.
Given the security nature and the nature of the AUKUS agreement, does that mean that we'll be targeting British and US students at all?
I'm not aware of us looking to target British or US students. However, it might be that one of the universities is looking to do that, but it's certainly not a market that's so far been identified for StudyAdelaide to pursue.
Thank you.
Just a question around sort of indirect benefits of international students. Is there any evidence or even anecdotal about other benefits to the economy? Like, do the parents come out to visit and spend money here? Do the students come back in 10 years' time? Is there any evidence about those benefits?
Yeah, there is significant indirect benefits of international students to South Australia. One of the most tangible ones I can think of is around the visiting friends and family. So recent data from Adelaide Airport showed that 20% of an international inbound passenger plane is made up of visiting friends and relatives. So those seats, while not all for international student visiting friends and relatives, a large proportion are likely to be. And those visiting friends and relatives spend in our community but also become ambassadors themselves for visiting South Australia and experiencing all that we have to offer. International students also do a lot to enrich the communities in South Australia, bringing diversity and vibrancy and multiculturalism to our state and to our region, out to our regions as well. And I also think something that is often hard to quantify but really important in our global standing is the impact that international students have once they graduate and go on to the workforce, whether that is in South Australia and contributing to our workforce needs, but also if those international students go on to their home country or third country, and the understanding and perspective they then have about South Australia because they chose to be here, and the way that they then become an ambassador and represent our state whenever they are talking about Australia. So there is no better way to talk about South Australia and our multiculturalism, our welcoming nature, our innovation, than to have spent years here experiencing it firsthand and then to go on and be able to actually be an advocate for it over time. We also have a large number, we have international students that I have met through alumni events who are now sending their children to the schools here in South Australia because they know firsthand what that experience would be like for their child. So there's a trust and an advocacy that then flows on through generations.
Thank you. Over for Marialta.
Thanks, and I think the benefits of international students in our state are strong. I'm interested in whether you've had feedback from any of your members broadly as to whether any of the barriers to international students coming here have included for maturer students who have children the school fees that are attached to our public school system for international children of international students, and also whether the federal government processing issues with Home Affairs have presented any problems, and whether you have any feedback on that complexity.
I haven't received any feedback specifically on the school fees for the dependence of an international student being a barrier for the choice for Adelaide as a study destination. On the issue of Home Affairs and visas, that is something that has been raised, and we continue to look to work with Home Affairs in terms of how to make sure that we can, as a country, welcome as many international students to Adelaide to start their program when they are meant to be starting their program. So that's something I know that Home Affairs have looked to add additional resources to over time.
Just on that over time, has there been a particular spike in the last year or two since COVID?
Of visa applications?
Of people complaining about rejections without explanation or delays in visa applications?
Some of our members have raised concerns about visa rejection numbers, and we have looked to advocate for that in forums.
Any further questions? And for Adelaide.
Just a supplementary to the Honourable Reggie Martin. Given the challenges, particularly with the CBD economy, with COVID, how important is it, as we were saying, a lot of the accommodation of international students is based in the CBD. How important is that to a really thriving CBD economy? And in particular with certain international student groups that some cultures might be cultures that love, shopping, particularly evenings, going out for dessert bars or things like that. And how important is that to our CBD economy in particular?
International students play a really significant role in the economy of the CBD. As you mentioned, many choose to reside in the CBD. Even if they don't choose to reside in the CBD, many travel into the CBD for their study. So they'll spend part of their days in the city. And that looks to then flow on to retailers, to hospitality, also to the opportunities to actually visit and contribute to things like our cultural events that are held in the city. And international students also, if they are residents of the city, therefore contribute more consistently because they're actually potentially shopping and doing their weekly shop from our shopping centres, what are they called? Supermarkets in the city. With international students in the city as well, there is again the opportunity for them to be actually experiencing not only the dessert bar, let's say, that's already here, but for some international students, they choose to actually start their own business to serve a need for their culture potentially and provide the option for other students from their culture to then be able to eat their local food or be able to experience the way that they do their hospitality. So we know of a number of international students who actually set up their own businesses in the city, further fueling the entrepreneurial spirit of international students.
Any further questions? Thank you so much, Ms Johnston, for your evidence. A transcript of today's proceedings will be available shortly.